Episode 50, The Camper's Possession Story. This is a story of a camping enthusiast named Greg, who enjoyed his off days from work by spending nights in the forest alone to gather his thoughts and escape the ironic loneliness of the city. Even though he had heard countless tales of haunting stories of others who went camping alone, it never really bothered him. He was at ease when he was out in nature, and never would he have guessed that one dreadful, haunting night in the forest would be something he would experience firsthand. So, one Friday evening, after Greg was off from work, he drove to a campsite that he had never gone to before. When Greg eventually arrived, the evening sky had just begun to hover over the grassland. The campsite sat near a cliff that overlooked the low-lying fields in the area. Greg looked around and saw no one else there. It was just the way he liked it, without any other loud groups of people who are out in nature for the sake of it and partied as though they were still in the city. Greg began to set up his tent and have it attached to the open trunk of his car. Once he had laid down his sleeping bag within his tent and started his campfire right outside the setup, Greg began preparing his cooking utensils and cooked his canned tuna and grilled sausages for dinner. This was the time during such camping trips where Greg liked to be in his thoughts and think about his life. Part of him was happy living his peaceful life alone, but another part of him also felt all too lonely. Greg wasn't exactly the sociable type, and at his age, many of his peers are out and about getting to know new people. But seeing how loud people around him are, it turned him off from initiating any conversations. So as he sat there, still deep in his thoughts, Greg suddenly felt slightly breathless. He initially thought that it was the high altitude that was causing this. He tried ignoring it, but then his ears began hearing the high-pitched screeching sounds, and his vision started to get blurry. That was when a slight worry began to surface. A flash of thought struck Greg that if something were to happen to him, there was no way that he could seek for help in time. Greg tried to stay calm, but then his hands began to shiver. He looked down at his hands and wondered why. He thought to himself, "It couldn't be possible that I'm shivering from the cold. It's even actually warm, sitting right next to the campfire." Right when Greg thought that the situation was worrying enough, Greg's vision got blurry. It became gradually worse, to a point where he could barely see what was in front of him. He stared right into his campfire, and through his blurry vision, the orange flames slowly began to lose their shape. The fire now seemed to look more like an orange canvas in motion as his fears began to creep up on him. Greg didn't know what was going on as he got more worried, and the screeches that he had been hearing got louder by the minute. Greg was looking around, trying to see if he could spot anyone else in the forest. He thought then that he could ask for help. As he was looking around, he suddenly felt his heart beating faster and faster. Greg then thought to himself, "Oh crap, am I having a heart attack? I'm screwed if anything happens now. There's no one to help." "It's okay. Breathe, Greg. Breathe." As Greg sat hunched forward on his foldable chair, now having one hand on his chest, he was about to resign to fate that he was indeed experiencing his health deteriorate. But right then, Greg began hearing a voice, a lady's voice. It seemed to whisper into his ears as it said, "Greg, you're not alone. I'm your friend." Greg looked around, thinking that the voice was of someone who had just arrived at the secluded area. But as he continued looking around, Greg realized that there was no one. He began wondering to himself where the sound was coming from. While all this was going on, Greg didn't realize that his blurry vision, the screeching sound, his heartbeat racing, and his hands shivering were slowly fading away. As Greg was looking around, that was when the voice whispered again, "Why are you looking around? I'm right here." Greg was scared but confused, and thought that the voice was just him hallucinating, since his fears were creeping up on him. Greg looked around again to see where the voice was coming from. But again, Greg saw no one. He then heard the woman's voice giggle. As Greg knew that there was no one else around right then, Greg's instincts kicked in as he felt that it was something else that was trying to communicate with him. A lingering spirit, perhaps? He just couldn't figure out if whatever it was had good or bad intentions. While Greg was focusing on the voice, it then said again, "I'm not around you, I'm in you," as the voice continued to giggle. Greg then suddenly felt his whole body go numb. His vision got blurry again as he saw his hands suddenly raised up to his eye level. He tried to put his hands back down, but he couldn't. He tried again, and still couldn't. He felt as though his hands were frozen still, and when he tried to move his body too was frozen. He then felt himself walking closer towards the campfire. Greg began feeling warmer as he got closer to the campfire, so he tried to pull back. But similarly, his efforts were futile, as he now stood right next to the fire, while the edges of the fire were beginning to brush against his cargo pants. Greg was beginning to feel hopeless when the same voice suddenly said, "You're always alone. I'll be your friend. Let's fly." Before he could react, Greg suddenly felt himself lifted off the ground. Greg tried to struggle and release himself as he was slowly floating further away from the ground, but again, he had no control over himself. He could think, but as he tried to connect his thoughts to his motor senses, it felt as though he was stiffly held back from moving out of his own will. Greg tried to scream, but he could feel his voice too being held back, and all he could do was listen. He could then hear a growling voice that came out from within him, which he too had no control over. Greg could feel his mouth open as he said, "We will stay here forever." Greg felt helpless as he was still floating right above the campfire and couldn't do anything but see and hear what was going on. Greg even began thinking to himself that maybe this was the end for him. Not that anyone would bother about him, as he didn't feel that anyone actually cared about him. But a part of him also didn't want to die alone in the forest. He knew that there is more in life that he wanted to do. For once, Greg finally felt the desire to seek help, any help, from anyone. That was when Greg suddenly felt a hard pull on his legs as he collapsed on the ground. All he saw was now himself lying on the ground as his head was on the grass while the campfire was still burning. Greg had no idea what was going on, was helpless, tired, and just wanted the haunting to end. He just wanted the night to end and go to sleep. But he wasn't sure if he fell asleep that he would wake up the following day. Greg was in a hopeless daze. That was when he saw someone approaching him and felt his body being shook. Then the voice spoke. This time, it wasn't the ghost lady's voice. Instead, what Greg heard was a comforting female voice that said, Honey, are you okay?" Greg immediately knew who it was. Although he was in a weak state, for once, Greg was glad that his mom was there. Greg could see that his mom sat right in front of him as he began moving. That was when he realized that he had regained control of his hands. Greg could also feel that the haunting had stopped, and that the spirit of whatever it was no longer in him. Greg slowly sat up as his mom said, "What happened, honey? Are you okay?" While still weak, Greg said, "How did you find me, Mom?" "I always know where you are, honey. I always set up that tracker system on your phone since you like to go on your camp trips alone," said Greg's mom. "But how did you know I was in trouble?" asked Greg. Greg's mom just sighed and said, "A mom always knows, my dear. Something felt really wrong this time right when you left home. And I know that since me and your dad divorced, you feel that no one cares about you. But we really do. Even now that you're all grown up and have started working, we still care about you. We know that you just like your alone time, but we are always on the lookout if anything were to happen to you." Greg then told his mom about what he had experienced earlier and then said, "I don't know why it happened, Mom. I've always camped alone, all this while, but I've never had anything disturb me before. Maybe it senses that you're feeling unhappy. These things like it when you're not happy. It is when you're most vulnerable, and it will take the chance to take control over you. And you were staring into space again, weren't you?" asked Greg's mom. "Yes, Mom, I couldn't help it. I was just thinking about things," said Greg. "Remember how I told you that staring blankly and thinking too much makes you more susceptible to such disturbances? Just be more careful next time, okay?" said Greg's mom. Greg nodded and went home with his mom that night. Months went by, and Greg was too afraid to go for another camping trip. The trip will always remind Greg about how it felt, in its finest details, to be possessed by the supernatural. From the physical numbness to the uncontrollable movements, he felt so hopeless, especially since Greg was aware of everything that was going on, but couldn't do anything to retaliate.